I'm very pleased to welcome you to the third Regional Policy Dialogue on environmental sustainability. My name is Eija Kiskinen, and I'm a Senior Global Relations Advisor in the OECD Environment Directorate. So this is already the third LAC Regional Policy Dialogue, and we are focusing this time on climate change adaptation. So we now move to the opening session, and we have three speakers, and we will start with Ms. Kerry-Ann Jones, the OECD Deputy Secretary General. The floor is open for your opening remarks, Ms. Kerry-Ann Jones.
Thank you, Eija. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to today's dialogue. As Eija said, the third, and this one, the Regional Policy Dialogues on Environmental Sustainability. Before I begin my remarks, or my first remark, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the European Facility for Development and Transition. Their financial support is crucial in holding these regional policy dialogues, which are organized as part of the OECD's project on enhancing green transition in the Latin American region, also known as LAC, Latin American and Caribbean. The focus of our dialogue today, as you heard, is climate change adaptation. Climate change adaptation requires urgent and effective action, particularly in this region. Evidence shows that this is the most disaster-prone region in the world, with the average number of extreme climate-related weather events having increased in most LAC countries over the last 2 decades. And unfortunately, it looks like this trend is set to continue. In the first few months of 2023, we have already seen heavy rains, landslides, and massive flooding in Peru, devastating forest fires in Chile, and prolonged droughts in Uruguay. It is clearly important at this point in time that LAC countries begin to shift from reactively managing disasters to proactively managing their risks. Every dollar invested in risk reduction and prevention can save up to 15 in post-disaster recovery. And every dollar invested in infrastructure resilience saves 4 in reconstruction. National adaptation plans can be a useful policy tool for countries to develop and implement adaptation instruments. However, to date, only 12 out of 31 LAC countries have submitted their adaptation plans under the UNFCCC process. National adaptation plans need local level action to guarantee that policies and measures appropriately reflect the social, economic, and environmental costs. As we are all aware, the impacts of climate change are highly localized and unevenly distributed. Vulnerable communities, strategic coastal infrastructure, and fragile ecosystems are often most severely impacted by climate-related weather events. The OECD's 2022 Latin American Economic Outlook provides policy recommendations on enhancing local-level adaptation action in support of a green and just transition. We also need to take action to halt and reverse the biodiversity loss associated with climate change. With the capacity to simultaneously achieve mitigation and adaptation objectives, nature-based solutions are effective options to address climate risks, improve ecosystem conservation, and ensure sustainable land use. Of course, our collective capacity to deliver on climate adaptation objectives depends on available and sufficient financing. Today, the current level is too low. For example, although nearly $45 billion was invested in green recovery measures in the LAC region following the COVID-19 pandemic, only 5% of funds were targeted to adaptation measures. The OECD is ready to support LAC governments as they work to identify and strengthen both policy and financing solutions for climate change adaptation. I hope today's dialogue will support these efforts in 3 ways. By outlining appropriate actions and mechanisms to strengthen climate change adaptation, by discussing how to best support regional prevention and preparedness actions, including monitoring and forecasting extreme weather events, and setting up early warning systems. And third, to identifying financing responses and prevention measures, as well as mobilizing investments. Also, of equal importance, and in the spirit of International Women's Day yesterday, I also encourage you to systematically include gender equality considerations in your adaptation policies. Moving forward, I sincerely hope that the EU and the OECD members will continue working together to support the implementation of the environmental sustainability priority of the LAC regional program. I look forward to seeing the outcomes of today's discussion explored in more detail at the OECD LAC regional program's first ministerial meeting on environmental sustainability, which will be held later this year in the second half of the year in Costa Rica. And with that, I want to wish you a very interesting and productive dialogue today. Thank you.
Much, DSG Jones. Now the next speaker is His Excellency Cynthia Villartiga Lacroix, Ambassador of Paraguay to France and co-chair of the OECD LAC Regional Program. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Muy buenas tardes, muy buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias.
Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you very much. I want to thank Deputy Secretary General Jones for her words. She gave very specific figures and very clear objectives and goals for our discussion today. It is a pleasure to welcome participants on behalf of the Regional LAC program to this third Regional Policy Dialogue on Environmental Sustainability, enhancing green transition in Latin America and the Caribbean, from commitment to action. And within the framework of this program, with the support of the European Union through the Regional Fund for Development in Transition, as Carrie-Anne well said. Today, we will discuss topics that are necessary and urgent: adaptation to climate change in our region. As Paraguay ambassador and co-chair of the OECD program with Colombia, I want to reaffirm our commitment to the promotion of an agenda that will bear tangible results. The program before included 3 pillars: productivity, social inclusion, and governance. We now added environmental sustainability pillar. And under this pillar, as Deputy Secretary General said, will be the pillar for the Costa Rica ministerial meeting on a date to be determined. The purpose will be to move forward with the green transition in the region, to explore interactions and synergy with the other 3 pillars of the program, to develop the potential of Latin America and the Caribbean, to maintain biodiversity, and to ensure transition to be fair and inclusive. Today's meeting is an opportunity to collaborate with this purpose, starting from a discussion to identify the best actions and policies that could be implemented in order to move forward with our adaptation to climate change, including different considerations like gender equality, supporting regional actions for prevention of extreme events, and mainly how the adaptation process will be financed. And this is our main challenge. Exploration, analysis, and access to innovative financing mechanisms will be key, as well as the support of our strategic allies that can facilitate compliance with our commitments. It is urgent for countries to decisively adopt actions to reduce the regional vulnerability before the impacts of climate change, to reduce risks and adaptation to before extreme events. It is necessary to include this in development sectors as a strategy to ensure competitiveness in the long term. At the same time, we are convinced that adaptation processes must be inclusive and include active participation of the private sector, academia, civil society, and media from a territorial perspective. In Paraguay, contribution to global emissions is marginal. However, there are many risks related to weather like extreme events, floods, droughts, fires, heat waves that affect the population on the one hand, but also affect their livelihood, their economic performance, the environment, and the availability of natural resources. Paraguay is especially vulnerable because its productive infrastructure is based on agriculture, livestock breeding, power generation, hydroelectrical power generation, and exports focus on many different fields that are sensitive to climate phenomena, and they depend on the rivers and in order to reach their destination. It is necessary to multiply Paraguay's effort, and therefore we have a strategy and a national plan for climate change adaptation. These include specific actions to adapt productive systems and social services in order to attain our welfare goals before climate change in 7 priority sectors: livestock production, food security, water resources, health, epidemiology, infrastructure, transportation and energy, environment, forests, fragile ecosystems, and education, among others. I am convinced that today's dialogue and tomorrow's dialogue will be highly valuable, and it will bring our agenda down towards compliance with the objects of OECD's regional program for Latin America and the Caribbean. I am convinced that every one of you, as well as myself, are committed. And I thank you for the opportunity you've given us to participate in this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lacroix. And we now move to the third speaker, who is Ms. Olga Bauschibert, the Deputy Head of Unit, Mexico, Central America, Caribbean, and Regional Operation from the European Commission. Ms. Bauschibert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And if you allow me, I will express myself in Spanish. Buenos días a todos los participantes que estéis en Latinoamérica.
Good morning to all participants in Latin America and the Caribbean, and good afternoon to participants in Europe. It is a pleasure to be here with you, opening this dialogue. This is a very timely moment, as seen from the European Union. It is very timely due to that topic which concerns everyone, which is key for the future of our children. But it's also timely due to this moment and the relationships between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the European Union. As you know, there is a summit of bi-regional heads of state summits, Latin America, Caribbean, and Europe on July 17th and 18th of this year, that will allow us to relaunch the positive agenda on which both regions will be working, and topics regarding climate change will be clearly prioritized. For quite a few years, we have not had a summit. Last one was 2015. Therefore, this is a very important moment, and this is already happening. It began happening last October when foreign affairs ministries got together in Argentina, launching a roadmap to regenerate and renovate the alliance between both regions. This will include a bi-regional ministerial meeting in Costa Rica next May with the environmental ministers. It will be an important moment to discuss topics, alliances, and modes to work jointly on different topics, which will be discussed here today. One important element of this summit is the agenda for investment under the Global Gateway Strategy, which is a European strategy to strengthen investments around the world. So we will be able to establish connections among partners in a fair, sustainable manner that will not create dependencies. Mostly, this is investment in infrastructure and education and health also. Now, for the summit, we want to develop an investment agenda for priority projects in terms of public policies, and where the European Union can bring added value to attract new European investors, to work with the private sector, helping governments to attain their public policies objectives, because public financing is not enough for the green transition necessary in this moment. And we will also attract financing from European banks. We are already discussing with different stakeholders, ambassadors here in Brussels, delegations before Latin American capitals and the Caribbean. We are also holding talks with the private sector and Latin American banks, such as CAV or MID, to find a way to move forward with the agenda. Our main objective is to support digital fair green transition. And this includes projects to reduce global emissions, other projects to promote sustainable agriculture. It also depends on the priorities set by each government. This agenda is highly ambitious, but it is important to bring in the private sector. This is quite a different modality, but it requires efforts from every stakeholders to open dialogues, to find new ways to innovate with financial engineering, collaboration, and amending public policies and others. And finally, I would like to put forward some examples of things that are already under development. Like, for example, we are promoting an initiative for issuing green bonds, where we will work with countries to develop taxonomies standardized with the European taxonomy, and that will allow us to bring new European investors to participate in green transformation projects. This initiative includes supporting collateral, so we can work in higher risk projects where investors are more reticent to invest. Obviously, we will continue offering support to traditional cooperation projects. I don't know if you are aware of certain projects that have been helping with the implementation of NAPs and NDCs. It is called Euroclima. Euroclimate is now moving into the Caribbean, including new areas of joint cooperation like biodiversity, or in the case of Caribbean, circular economy, which is essential for this region. And I want to finish by pointing out a challenge. The channel is how to work in transnational projects. We have put forward two initiatives in two regions, one in the Amazon region and another initiative for 5 forests in Mesoamerica. These two initiatives focus on biodiversity and forest protection. And finally, for the Caribbean, we launched a green partnership focused on resilience and disaster management. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Paus-Gibert. And thank you to all three speakers of your thoughts and directions and guidance. This will be very, very useful for us for our discussions over these 2.5 days. And this concludes the opening session, and we can move then to the session 1, which is aligning adaptation priorities with the international commitments and addressing adaptation needs with the national policies. And I would like to invite Rodolfo Lassi. Dr. Rodolfo Lassi, he's a director for climate action and environment for Latin America and special envoy on climate change, climate matters to the United Nations in OECD Secretariat. So Rodolfo, the floor is yours. You can take the floor and introduce the speakers.
Thank you very much, Aya. Buenos días, buenas tardes a todos. Para nosotros, bueno, pues es...
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. And for us, this is a third dialogue on this topic for the countries from Latin America and Caribbean that are members of the OECD and that have indicated that this is a priority for the region. So this third dialogue not only indicates how important it is to protect our population and our ecosystems and infrastructure, but also to add to our plans, national plans, the resilience and the vulnerability factor, which is very difficult to measure. As our Deputy Secretary General has just mentioned, we have very few countries that have issued to the Climate Change Commission their adaptation plans. That doesn't mean that they are not taking any actions, but simply it means that they are not synchronizing their effort with an international and regional effort so that we somehow have a joint strategy that allows us to have synergies and partnerships. That this is what we want to become more effective in order to achieve our goals. Unlike mitigation, adaptation is more difficult to measure, not only because we do not have the indicators already developed and accepted. There's already a working team that is devoted to define these indicators. OECD has made an effort to do this, and our first speaker will be Rodrigo Pizarro, who is in charge of the information division that has to do with climate change, and he has developed together with his team a set of maps and key indicators, and he will explain very clearly where we stand and where we can go jointly and how OECD can provide this information, this vital information to all the other countries. Evidently, we have to address national perspectives from a global context. And well, Colleen, after Rodrigo, will also talk about the linkages between these extreme climate phenomenon, the phenomena that are leading to losses and damages that must be linked to points. And in that case, the climate change will be very difficult for all our countries. And even though we try to implement the adaptation, it won't be as effective as we want it to be. Unlike mitigation, but in a different dimension, if we do implement the right effort, we can reduce our emissions. But many times we can invest in adaptation, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that the adaptation is going to happen. Therefore, the adaptation mechanisms, that is resilience projects, are different from the adaptation projects. And of course that they can be coordinated, but they are different. And the response from the state before this extreme climate phenomena and the local capacities in order to recover from these disasters are also part of today's discussion. We'll also have the participation of Milagros Sandoval, who is the General Director of Climate Change and the Certification from Peru, and Mr. Joel Ayala. He's a climate change adaptation expert from Paraguay. And we've also heard the challenges that Paraguay is facing nowadays. This was mentioned by the ambassador. And we'll also have the presence of Mrs. Miriam Medel, who is the Chief of Global Policy Advocacy Regional Cooperation. And it's from the UNCCD, which is on the certification. I believe that all these agendas are work together, and the adaptation topic is common to all these agendas. And our Mrs. Deputy Secretary General has already mentioned these, and all these topics are linked and are closely related to mitigation. But in regards to the recovery of these ecosystems, I believe that Miriam is going to give us a very good coverage on this topic. She comes from the executive direction on climate change. She is a global expert on this topic, and we are looking forward to listening on her perspective. Without any further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Rodrigo. Then we'll open the floor for the participants' participation. So Rodrigo, please go ahead. Hello, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Rodrigo Pizarro. I'm the manager or director of climate change program in the OECD. I have some information that I believe that is relevant to share with you.
But I have left the presentation in English for those that have difficulty with the Spanish. So once again, good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Esta presentación es una presentación muy breve. Yo no sé si...
This is a very brief presentation. I don't know what's happening. It's something that I cannot control with the slides. Can we see the next slide? Okay, thank you. Next one, please. We've been working for some time on identifying indicators to represent the challenges that we're facing in regards to climate change, including the local policy, risks, vulnerabilities, and some other aspects. Regarding risks is a very complex topic, and it is the central point of these three aspects, that is vulnerability, hazards, and exposure. And As a consequence, this is a multidimensional phenomenon that has to be studied, and it represents complexity. Next, we have developed a database. It's a very comprehensive database that includes the possible threats in regards to climate change. And this is part of a project that is trying to identify risks. So far, we have identified 7 threats, and they have an impact in different areas. For example, the agricultural area and the public sector. And this has also been presented in a study that is available for everybody. And it's done by Michael in the year 2022. Is at the bottom of the screen, and you can see the information of this document. And we've used this information so that you can see specifically the case of Latin America and how possible it is to do an analysis and what kind of analysis we can do. Next slide, please. What I'm going to show you, I'm going to show it very briefly because I don't have a lot of time. These are the type of threats that we are facing. You can see 2 maps on the screen, and these 2 maps jointly identify the number of threats that we can face in a specific region. The darker the colors, the colors become darker from 1 to 5, and you can see there the number of hazards. The darker the color, the greater the number of threats in a specific region. As you can see, there are multiple threats on the Amazonian region, in Yucatan, also Central America and the Caribbean. All these regions can eventually be identified using this information. We use geospatial databases that allow us to identify these areas that can be subjected to all these threats, and that's why they need a specific policy to face these threats. Next slide, please. This database shows different threats that have been identified so far. This threat is wildfires threat. It is basically identified in South America, Yucatan again. And this is a measurement reflected from these regions that show a very high or extreme wildfire risk. I'm Chilean, and you can see my country there on the map is free from threats, but we can see smaller regions that are extremely affected by wildfires. As a matter of fact, this last summer, we saw a negative impact on Chile, and as a consequence, Chile had to take action and identify what policies we could do in order to improve our reaction to these threats. Next slide, please. Now, regard cyclones in the Caribbean, this is based on the information that we have. We know that this is a serious problem, and this is geospatial information that we got from different databases. And next slide, please. Here on this map, we can see a different kind of impacts and threats. These impacts are related to droughts. On the right, you can see a map of areas that are specifically affected by droughts. There are areas that are very red, mainly on the Pacific coast and on the northern area of Mexico. Next slide, please. And this is also related to a specific the indicators that are related to soil moisture. As you can see, our colleagues in Paraguay, they can see that Paraguay has been affected has been affected by drought due to the reduction of soil moisture in the last years. And these, I'm talking about the period 2017-2021, there was a reduction of soil moisture that accounts for minus 10%. So this area is going to be more affected in the near future. Next slide, please. This slide shows the heat stress. The first measurement that is done is a measurement different to the one that we've done in regard to the increase of temperature. We are considering the number of hot days per year, that is temperature higher than 35 degrees Celsius. And we can see areas that are mainly affected by hot days. And we have the Yucatan Peninsula, the northern area of Mexico, and then South America. Next slide. This is also related to specific indicators. As you can see, once more on the left, we have a chart that shows Salvador, Honduras, and El Salvador, which are the populations that are more affected to heat stress. Paraguay is the population, 90% of the population is exposed to this heat stress. In the diamond, the yellow diamond, you can see the heat that was observed and in the year 1979. So we can see how much the heat has changed between 79 and 21. So you can see a radical change in countries such as Bolivia, Brazil, and Paraguay. Next slide, please. This map shows the increase of temperature. It's the same map that we saw in the previous slide, but it only shows the increase of temperature, and it indicates in what specific regions there was an increase of temperature observed. And here, basically, the diamond is reflected geospatially. And next slide, please. And the measurement of heat stress is related to tropical nights. That is temperatures higher than 35 degrees Celsius at night. And we can see these areas in Latin America that are being affected by these tropical nights. Next slide, please. And we can see on the left the indicators on the different countries with areas that are highly affected due to these additional tropical nights per year, and a great amount of our populations exposed to these tropical nights. This has a direct impact on health and the use of energy and the physical infrastructure. Next slide, please. Additionally, we can see those areas that as a consequence of climate change, we have seen an increase of temperature. We can see the Amazonian region, Amazonian basin, all these areas have been affected by tropical nights. That is, the tropical nights are increasing from the Amazonian region to lower regions such as Argentina and Uruguay that are being affected by these tropical nights. Next slide, please. This is a selection of the information. As we all know, Latin America is closely related to different sectors or productions such as agriculture. This is a measurement of the number of days with extreme rainfall per year. And this is shown on the map. We have the concentration in specific areas. Next slide, please. On the left, we can see the indicators once more. We can see the cases, the case of Nicaragua, Guatemala, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname, who are highly affected by these days with extreme rainfall, where we have seen very significant changes for the last 20 years. Next slide, please. As a consequence of this, we can see the northern side of Latin America, Guyana and Suriname, that are mainly affected by these events of extreme rainfall events. Next slide, please. So as a consequence, we see a series of indicators that show the Latin American situation is a severe situation due to the threats. And we have seen, based on different indicators, that these effects and events are increasing. We are going to provide this information in a document in the month of April, but it will also be available for you so that you can carry out your own analysis. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. So now I would like to pass the floor to Colleen. We're a little bit behind and we'll have to speed up.
This is the time for your presentation.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Lacey, for your introduction and Rodrigo for this detailed presentation. My name is Colleen Pouy and I work at the OECD Environment Directorate. I think I have sent a presentation if the slides could be shown.
¿Nos podrían ayudar en darle los derechos a Colleen para hacer la presentación, por favor?
Could you help us with the presentation, please, so that Colleen can start showing her presentation?
Great, thank you. Okay, we can move already to the first slide, please. So the next slide, please. Yes, so thank you. At the end of last year, we published here at the OECD Environment Directorate a report that reviews the most recent science on climate tipping points. And today I will share with you some headline messages from this report, and we'll briefly discuss some implications for adaptation in Latin America and the Caribbean. Next slide, please. So under global warming, some of the complex systems in the climate are susceptible to be tipped from one stable state to another. Scientists have now identified around 15 different elements, which they estimate could tip at different levels of global warming, which you can see on this map. In a nutshell, what is the science and evidence telling us today? Next, please. So first, there are clear signs that we are already approaching several of these tipping points. Second, some tipping points are likely at much lower levels of global warming than previously thought. Some of these already within the Paris Agreement range of below 2 degrees of warming. These are represented as circles on this map. And third, we know that if climate tipping points are crossed, the planet and social economic systems will undergo profound and often irreversible changes. Next slide, please. More specifically, what do tipping points imply in terms of impacts in the LAC region? Well, first of all these tipping points have global impacts that would also affect the region. An abrupt thaw of permafrost would release enough carbon to amplify global warming significantly. The Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, if tipped, would completely disintegrate, and together they hold over 10 meters of global sea level rise. A slowdown or collapse of ocean currents would disrupt tropical precipitation patterns. Specifically, the Amazon tipping point would have very large impacts for the LAC region, in addition to amplifying global warming. It has been shown that climate change and deforestation combined can cause the tropical forest to abruptly turn into a drier savanna state. This would disrupt weather patterns and water cycles regionally and increase extreme events such as droughts and wildfires. Importantly, also, all tipping points are interlinked through the climate system, as you can see on this map. So tipping one element makes tipping another more likely. And in the worst case, we could have a domino cascade of tipping points. The physical impacts of tipping points would also cause cascading social economic impacts, very likely leading to losses and damages. And this would include, of course, profound implications for biodiversity and ecosystem service provisions, impacts on energy access for regions that rely on hydropower, for example, disruptions of agricultural systems that would threaten food security regionally, and increased risks of migrations. So tipping points add urgency to the global warming mitigation challenge. But given how quickly we are approaching already some of these, we're most likely also going to have to adapt to some of these impacts. Next slide, please. So finally, here are some issues to consider for adaptation strategies. First, scientists have developed methods to detect early warning signals that we may be approaching some tipping thresholds. And this type of information needs to feed into adaptation strategies now. Second, adaptation planning needs to consider some plausible high impact scenarios where tipping points do occur. For example, scenarios with higher sea level rise from ice sheet collapses. Third, given the scale of the impacts, taking into account tipping points could push for a transformational approach to adaptation with more drastic measures to be considered that would include, for example, enforcing no building zones and planned retreats in some coastal areas, or ensuring a decentralization and diversification of energy sources away from hydropower in the Amazon, for example. And finally, there are still high uncertainties around the timing and scale of tipping points. Therefore, adaptation measures that are low cost and come with large co-benefits in any case, even if tipping points do not occur, can be chosen as no regret policies. And this is especially the case for nature-based solutions. So for example, coastal ecosystem conservation, but also forest protection in the Amazon that would mitigate the risk of a tipping point there. So overall, given the potential for catastrophic impacts associated with tipping points, it is crucial that adaptation strategies take into account the most up-to-date scientific information around these tipping points right now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Bueno, para mantener esta visión global, vamos a pasar
In order to
ahora.
have this global perspective, now we're going to pass the floor to Miriam Medel. Miriam Medel, if you could take the floor, thank you. Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you very much for having invited me to this event and for the previous presentations. I think that they have clearly exposed how complex this problem is and how important it is to understand to all of us that we have to talk simultaneously about mitigation, resilience, reduction of vulnerability, and adaptation. When I was introduced, I represent the third convention of Rio, and that is the little sister or the little convention and so on. However, this convention was born due to different situation, and it was adopted 2 years later after the convention in Rio de Janeiro. This convention looks to support their members in the sustainable management of their resources, water and land. Nowadays, we know that as humankind, we are facing a great crisis, a pandemic, biodiversity crisis, food crisis, and desertification, soil degradation, and we need to find a solution for multiple crises. So we have to be very optimistic. Latin America is a region that has more than 40% of all the forests in the region, and they have been degraded. And the region has one of the most viable and most complex ecosystems in the world, but at least 20% of the land of these ecosystems has been completely destroyed, and the other 20% has been severely damaged. And the causes include agriculture, small and large scale, infrastructure construction, and mining. 58% of greenhouse gas emissions are due to the changes of land use, and 14% of the rural population lives in degraded agricultural land that accounts for 44,000 people. And if I talk about drought, which is another priority for our convention, we have to say that the region is one of the most vulnerable to droughts. Chile, for example, currently is facing a drought in a ninth consecutive year. In the Central America corridor has been affected too by this drought, and this is a consequence of the climate change. The good news is that in the case of the desertification convention, there's body of decisions from the international community in order to work for a concept that is not very well known, which is called neutral degradation of land. And that is very similar to neutralization of carbon. And that is, we need to continue working. 99% of the calories come from the land use. It doesn't matter what you eat or what you do, and 99% of these calories come from the land, and a great number of these materials come from land use, land ecosystems. Therefore, if we are going to continue exploiting this resource, we need to work in order to restore these degraded lands and to restore the ones that we've already used. Yes, the investment is not that large. We like to make an estimation, the yearly estimation for future pandemics, because we've thought about that because of COVID, and this could account to $2 billion. That's the yearly cost. But if we invest 1% of these costs, we could prevent these pandemics and to restore nature. The restoration of the land requires very complex interventions from different organizations that includes governmental institutions, and that would be a great step for all our institutions to have an all government and all society approach, because it is not enough by having the environment ministry or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to be completely involved in this situation or in these topics at the international level, if at the local level or the national level, they are not, they do not have good relationships with the other ministries that are devoted to other sectors. And also at the state levels. And I would like to finish by saying that our key messages are to consider land restoration a priority, to have healthy lands as an operational link between ecosystems, the climate, and the people. If we have healthy soil, they absorb better carbon, and they preserve biodiversity, and they keep providing food, which is essential to us. Another proposal is to transition to a crisis mindset, because we are facing a current crisis, and sometimes we seem to forget that. And finally, we need to work in the transformation of our food systems, and not only the agricultural production, but also the whole system. Since we start planting, harvesting, and packaging, until this gets to the final part of the cycle, the food cycle. And the last thing that I would like to say in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean is we have to have certainty of the possession of the land. We need people to feel sure about the ownership and the product of their work of the land, and the joint work with other with the other authorities that are in charge of these priorities, that is climate change. And I have to leave in 10 minutes, but in the meantime, I will continue here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much, Miriam.
Directora General de Cambio Climático y de Certificación.
She's Director of Climate Change and Certification. It is a very close topic, and they are also well advanced in terms of public policy. Milagros, please. Good morning, good afternoon from Lima. I want to thank you for
y poder empezar señalando también algunos temas que sin duda son importantes y agradecer por las presentaciones anteriores que sin duda nos traen y nos traen muchas preguntas en relación a cómo aterrizamos estos temas a nivel del país. Entonces, yo quería empezar primero por comentarles un poco cómo estamos estimando en el Perú la posibilidad de no actuar ante el cambio climático. Pues hemos estimado que de no actuar nos costaría una reducción del Producto Bruto Interno entre 11% hasta 20% hacia el año 2050. Y eso sin duda es sumamente riesgoso en un país como el Perú. ¿Por qué es tan alto? Porque el Perú depende, todas sus actividades, casi todas sus actividades económicas dependen del aprovechamiento de los recursos naturales. Y es por eso que somos también muy vulnerables al cambio climático y a los efectos que tenemos en el país. Siguiente, por favor.
Effects. Next, please.
Y bueno, en relación, creo que no se ve la siguiente.
Well, I think we cannot see the slide, but next slide, but let's move forward. So what is Peru doing to address this issue? And let me begin by pointing out three topics. The first one is legal certainty. How do we do that? It has been mentioned that it is necessary to attract private investment, and you need clear legal frameworks to attract investment, whether public or private. And for that reason, Peru has been working on a framework law on climate change, establishing processes linked to objectives of the climate change agenda by assigning responsibilities and working jointly with national, subnational, and local stakeholders to strengthen three very important governance spaces and incorporating those topics that are related to climate change in all the plans, programs, and projects of the national and subnational governments. That means we have these actions cross-cutting and including different stakeholders throughout the country. A second important point to address the crisis and the vulnerability in Peru. We have to begin by having information for decision changing. We have a national adaptation plan, which is a strategic document that helps us with climate change adaptation in Peru. Our goal is to reduce and avoid damages and losses. And regarding scientific information in the country, let me tell you that we have developed climate scenarios to the years 2030 and 2050. And here you can see different scenarios for the different time points. We also develop some risk scenarios to 2030 and 2050, and it is necessary to prioritize 4 elements associated to climate change, like droughts and floodings, landslides, and the glacier retreat, which is already causing important losses regarding water resources. A third point I would like to emphasize, but it's probably the most important one, and is how do we bring this down to the ground? How can we move forward? Peru has identified 84 measures for adaptation to date, and they are part of our MVC, but it is necessary to identify more. These measures help us work, and we have some examples on screen. like early alert, strengthening of actions to address public health issues, which became so important due to the pandemic in a country like Peru that was highly vulnerable to the pandemic. We need implementation of interventions for water seeding and harvest, and we have to work strengthening capacities in the fishing and aquaculture sector. And finally, just to mention that progressing with better science and for better decisions, we need to move forward. We need to continue studying. And part of our commitments from the last COP is to establish an observatory for scientific knowledge on climate change. So we want to invite all of you to the launch of our observatory next March the 24th, which will bring science closer for better decision making at the national and subnational levels. Thank you very much. Thank you, Milagros. And now I will give the floor to Joel Ayala. He is an expert in climate change adaptation and decision making in the environmental ministry in Paraguay. We've seen that Paraguay is there on the top levels in many of the indicators presented by Rodrigo. So let's give the floor to Joel. Thank you very much, Rodolfo. Good morning and good afternoon. My presentation will focus on advances made regarding adaptation in Paraguay. Here's my first slide. Let's go to the next slide. I will show you this timeline that was developed in Paraguay. This was developed in the adaptation department. And here we can see events intensifying, continuity increases with greater impacts, red dots, severe storms, blue dots, floods, and forest fires have intensified as of 2019, and droughts in yellow, forest fires in orange. And this has been highlighted by what my colleagues already presented. You see a red line that follows the increase in events. And this shows mean global temperature that is increasing, and extreme events are also increasing in our country. Next slide, please. These are the national instruments developed as of 2016. Paraguay has established adaptation as a national priority. And here we have national contributions, a national strategy, and a national plan and guides for the development of local and sector plans to move forward with the implementation, with addressing this issue at the local and sector level. They all have QR codes that allow people to access these documents. Next slide. This is more up to date, and in here we see the update. Next slide, please. This is from 2021. Paraguay updated the NDC to reaffirm the country's commitment to adaptation, stating that Paraguay is highly vulnerable and adaptation is a priority. This document is the first adaptation communication, as Ambassador said, where we identify 7 key sectors for adaptation. And there are 25 goals that will increase resilience in the sectors, in the communities, and in the country in general. Next slide, please. Last year, we updated our national adaptation plan. One of the first countries to do so, it is the Adaptation 2022-2030. On the right side is the operational plan of Paraguay, showing how adaptation should be addressed at the national and sub-national level, including municipal and urban development plans and facilitating factors that can allow us to correctly implement this national adaptation plan. Next slide, please. Here are some advances regarding adaptation. We have the roadmap to 2030. It is a draft, and then we have the first national communication, and the national adaptation plan can be implemented. They have to go from the paper to the ground, and this roadmap is going to establish how this will be done. Next slide, please. This shows different studies that are being developed in our agency. We have this outlook of climate scenarios in Paraguay with rainfall, minimum, mid, and maximum temperatures, the near, mean, and far future. And it also has the ND gain for each department. This global adaptation index is being used nationally. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is a list of challenges Paraguay is facing. We have a need of financing for implementing our policies and the national plan. We need to appropriate all adaptation means among different sectors. We need to work with different stakeholders, and we have also to increase our analysis of adaptation indexes at the district level. And with the new data obtained in 2022, there is a high vulnerability to climate change, and therefore we have to follow our roadmap, and we need to develop indicators. And that's all on my part. Thank you very much. I'm here for questions later. Thank you very much, Joel. This information is really wide, but it accurately shows the situation in Latin America and some of the answers countries are giving through their plans of adaptation. We pretty much run out of time, but there's still 5 minutes for one additional intervention from any of the almost 90 participants who are active in Zoom. I see a few raised hands. Rodrigo Gilberto from Costa Rica. You have the word. Good morning. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity. I am from Chile, not Costa Rica. I'm sorry, it says CR. Well, it's okay. I'm from Chile. Now I want to use this opportunity to say the following. I teach at the Physics and Mathematics School of the National Chile's Opportunity, but we talk a lot about public policy, and we are concerned with the models for adaptation. RE6 criticizes traditional models that have been applied to adaptation planification like predict then act, and therefore climate risk and measures are put in the center. But what we have seen in Chile through different studies is that the core issue is not the measures, but the management of the whole process to introduce the measures. There is a measure that is necessary, but the measure faces obstacles. Those obstacles have been identified in RA4 and 5. And sometimes factors are for their implementation are as important as this. So this goes from modeling risk to modeling measures and factors that will allow or not these measures to be implemented. And therefore we are working with development systemic models that allow us to understand this whole process systemically speaking. And we are working on systemic modeling that will be transformed into mathematical modeling that helps us develop scenarios for public policies. We know that the region has many things to do, but regional institutions are weaker with different issues like capacity and legal instruments. So we have to look at this systematic modeling so that we can tell you which button you have to push and how to help you understand. And there's a second phase in adaptation planning models that have to do with understanding the social model of adaptation. This is a lot of work that we are developing, and today planning guides for climate change in Chile are starting to be modeled based on the information we are producing. So if anyone wants to hear about this, maybe I can help by putting something in the chat. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. And this is exactly the kind of tools countries require. I'll give the floor to Isamari Sanchez from Panama. Hopefully I got your country right. Yes, you did. Thank you very much. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. That's right. Regarding national policies, I would like to talk a little bit of Panama's work. We agree that in order to address climate change risks and all risk and environmental issues at the regional levels, countries must go from reactive disaster management to proactive risk management to mitigate climate change effects. And we created a national reforestation program to increase forest coverage in degraded areas and basins, and in deforested areas. We have increased forest coverage by 3%, with 68% coverage now. Now, regarding public policies, Panama attained 30 by 30 goal in 2021, making us blue leader. And today we want to share with you that last week we attained 54.6% of our land being protected, thus protecting over 50% of the total marine area, becoming one of the few countries in the world to attain this moment. The only one in Latin America going significantly over the goal of protecting at least 30% of the sea areas by 2030. Panama went to the Eurasian point of encounter to debate protection of the ocean and ocean sustainability, inviting everyone to become part of the solution. The oceans are global resources connecting and bringing us together, and many actions were presented. We also established or decreed a law that says that by 2025, 10% of public entities vehicles should be electric vehicles, and 40% by 2030. Panama is becoming a national and regional reference and world reference in climate agendas, and we are transforming climate change management, promoting the importance of renewing, how to plan, how to prioritize, and how to assign public investment budgets for sustainable green development. Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank Panama for their leadership, especially regarding the oceans, because ocean governance has advanced thanks to your diplomacy, to your environmental diplomacy. Finally, I give the floor to Pedro Gutierrez from Mexico. Go ahead, Pedro. Good morning to everyone in this side of the world, and good afternoon to those in Europe. I work in the Environmental Federal Protection Agency. We are in charge of surveilling law enforcement and enforcement of international agreements. When we attend an international forum, we get an explanation of what's going on, what are the causes that we are facing a huge crisis, extreme crisis, very serious crisis. And we always talk about the issues, but applying solutions in countries with high levels of marginalization, poverty, it's very difficult. In Mexico, there are over 30 million people living in highly marginalized conditions. And when we tell them the crisis, and they said, what crisis? We always live in crisis. Crisis is our natural state. We live in the forests, we live in the rainforest, and then they tell us, you cannot use the forest the way you've always done it. You have to do it this way. And they are imposing limitations on our way of living as we usually did. So now we are working using people from the communities themselves as environmental stewards. We have environmental stewards in our agency that help us with surveillance and with the preservation of resources. Our environmental stewards are people who voluntarily go to live at the place. They train and they help those living there to care for and preserve the environment. Now we want to incorporate them into the new guidelines so that we can link our regulations with this program. So environmental stewards will now help us greatly to get people prepared, to help them understand how to present a complaint, how to have better access to information, better access to justice, and better access to participation. We always say there is a crisis and we need public policies, but for public policy to be public, it requires the cooperation of the citizens, of the people. Otherwise, it's not a public policy, but a state policy. And the state may have very clear policies, but it is sometimes difficult to bring them down. So whenever I attend such a forum, I like to see or to develop ideas on how to bring everything that is being said to the ground, to put it into practice with the communities, because we know the red flags, we know the red points, we know what's going on, we know about nature-based solutions, we know all this, but when we bring this down to communities, it is very difficult, as Professor Rodrigo mentioned. And so this is an issue of management, and I believe this should be a relevant focal point, focusing on communities that have other communities, which is having food to eat every day and trying to sustain themselves every day. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pedro, for bringing this topic to the table about how to involve communities that safeguard our forests and the Escazú Agreement, because all OECD members have ratified the Escazú Agreement and they are trying to implement it with the focus you just mentioned. Now, if I may, I will link this with what Olga Baus from the European Union said. It is true that the region requires a taxonomy for adaptation programs. I have experience in managing bonds and reduction credits, and regarding forests, forest community bonds managed by indigenous communities and origin peoples are cheaper than industrial bonds, but it should be the other way around, because it's communities that have been able to preserve the forest for 500 years, more than 500 years in our territories. So now we are looking into new policies as recently announced by the government in Brazil. We've been looking into Colombia's initiatives, and we've been looking into Peru and Mexico with the environmental stewardship Pedro just mentioned. And this is where we must truly work to look at the value of preserving nature in the hands of regional peoples and put a price to nature-based solutions that will allow us to attain complete financing for the actions and to maintain them throughout time, giving value to the natural resources, but also giving value to the social organization maintaining this natural resource and that has maintained it throughout centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. And thank you for your moderation, and thank you to all speakers and all those who ask questions. And we will be moving now to the session 2, which is financing climate adaptation in Latin America. And the moderator of this session is Mr. Michael Mullen, economist in the Environment, Transitions and Resilience Division of the OECD Environment Directorate. And I hope that we can try to keep for the speakers the time limit that they have, so that we will have time also more questions and more interactive discussions. So I now pass it to Michael. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon from Paris. It's really a pleasure to moderate this session on financing climate change for adaptation. I've taken Aya's comment on board. Given the previous moderators have kept a very tight schedule, I will do my best to continue for this session as well. So look, just as the context for this discussion, we know there's a large untapped potential for investments in adaptation. Analysis by the Global Commission on Adaptation identified just in 5 areas, $1.8 trillion of global investment opportunities with an average return of around $4 for every dollar invested. Filling this investment gap has a huge potential to yield a triple dividend, reducing risks, supporting economic development, and providing wider co-benefits for people in the environment. However, we also see that finance is not flowing at the required scale. Just to give an example, in the LAC region, only 14% of multilateral climate finance has gone towards adaptation objectives. So the aim of this session is really to focus on understanding what are the barriers, what are the opportunities, and how can we move forward on this agenda. To bring this discussion together, I'm delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel. In particular, I would like to introduce Ms. Solanel Bonilla, Sustainability Director at the Ministry of Environment from the Dominican Republic, Mr. Eduardo Gonzalez, who's a specialist in climate change, water, environment at the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, and my colleague at OECD, Mr. Sebastián Nieto Parra, Head of Latin America and the Caribbean Unit at the OECD Development Center. So to start the discussion, first I would like to invite Ms. Alicia Montalvo Santamaria, who is the Climate Action and Positive Biodiversity Manager and Corporate Vice President of Strategic Programming at the Development Bank of Latin America. So, Ms. Santamaria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael, and all the team. Thanks, Dimitra. Let me begin by saying that I will speak in Spanish. I hope there is no problem for that. But in any case, I can react to the questions in both languages. So thanks a lot. Bueno, yo quería, creo que este es un tema fundamental y que además
I believe that this is an essential topic. Unfortunately, we are focusing on international debates. For many years, we've been talking about mitigation, resources for mitigation, and even though we're talking about adaptation financing for adaptation, was not something clear, and we didn't know exactly about the scope, commitments, and anything like that. And that's why, to me, it's extremely important to be able to talk about this topic today. First of all, I wanted to talk about the recent conference on natural disaster PR23 that was celebrated recently. And they cover some topics that were very relevant, and I would like to mention as my introduction. Now, the risk of disasters, adaptation, and damage and losses mechanisms that we have and that have been approved in this COP in Egypt are the different factors of the same problem. So in the end, what we're doing is to prevent that the disasters related to climate change cause very large damages through resilience, adaptation mechanisms, and other actions so that we can recover from these natural resources. In this regard, in this conference, I would like to point out, well, I guess some of you were there. And in this conference, we mentioned that there's a possibility to mobilize some funding, some financing that are not being fully used. And that's why in my presentation, I would like to focus on explaining how we use the Fund for Adaptation for the climate change. And these tools have shown to be essential to mobilize resources for adaptation. On the other hand, I would like to say that in this conference, we also mentioned that we need to be more creative. We've already known this for some time, but this calls our attention that forces the CAF and some other financing institutions to work jointly and to develop new financial instruments to be able to supply them. The world of insurance and microinsurance to work in green bonds, as we were told in the previous session. They require a very robust taxonomy in order to work for readaptation. So we need to work on new financial instruments that cover this two-dimensional issue, that is natural disasters and adaptation, because they are not separated things. They are two things that are linked, and we as banking institutions, financing institutions have to understand this. And we have to focus on this, or we are going to lose sight of what is really important. And we have to have a joint vision to be successful. And to begin with my presentation, let me reiterate that we have the commitment to be the green bank of this region, and this is complex to state, but to tell you the truth, we are happy because in the commitment that we stated in the year 2021 to devote 30% of the allocations or approvals to green topics, last year in the 2022, we were able to reach a 30% figure. Evidently, this makes us extremely happy, but most of all, what we want is to know what kind of financing we are going to provide. And in order to do that, adaptation is extremely important, and Latin America is facing this challenge, and we want to develop our instruments in this region. Next slide, please. We have recently approved the corporate strategy, and currently I'm in Santiago, Chile, where we have presented this new CAF strategy for the following years. And I would like to point out clearly how we have presented the green topic in our agenda. First of all, we have identified a series of topics that we call mission agendas, and we have certain topics that are important. For example, energy just transition, resilient territories, inclusive well-being, physical and digital infrastructure, productivity and internationalization, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. And when I talk about resilient territories, I'm talking about just transition and urban systems and mobility and energy. The energy sector is very vulnerable to climate change, but we are very happy to know that we've located the biodiversity of the ecosystem services that are very important for adaptation, because they are not only key for mitigation but also for adaptation, and they have become a priority. And we are working on some important initiatives, like the one that has to do with migration routes of birds and how we are going to use these routes in order to identify fragile ecosystems that have to be reinforced in order to favor an adequate adaptation. And economy topics such as blue economy and oceans, everything that has to do with the coastal areas, that is also a key priority, mainly talking about Latin America and the Caribbean countries. We're really working on that. And of course, the agricultural sector. And agriculture is one of the most multiple sectors in regards to adaptation. So this means that out of all these resources that we are going to continue using for the green agenda, these are going to our priorities regarding topics, and they address adaptation. And of course that we are going to have a cross-sectional agenda where we continue working in green operations, we continue working in mitigation, but we're also developing a methodology according to the multilateral banks. And you know that all this is important, and we just wanted to restate this because the adaptation has to be the core of our instruments. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give some examples of some projects that are our flagship projects that have to do with adaptation financing. We have a project in Galapagos, and this is an important project for us because it gathers several characteristics that we mentioned so far. How important it is to join mitigation and adaptation and the energy just transition. And this project that we're currently working on is very significant. We've worked with the Green Fund for Climate. We have devoted $30 million, and we also have co-financing from CAF. And this is also going to be done through the private sector. This is a very comprehensive project that handles the sea part, the sea reserve of Galapagos, and the control of introduced species, energy matrix, resilience of Galapagos, and resilience of climate. So we have to face challenges jointly. So we are thinking about reduction emissions, but also increasing the resilience of this area. So all this is adaptation, and it is combined with mitigation. And this is the type of instruments that we are promoting, and we want to promote it with all the rest of the countries. Next slide, please. Another project that is worth mentioning that has to do with blue economy is an initiative that we have with the fund, the Environmental Global Fund and the GEF. And here, this area is very vulnerable in regards to climate changes. They live, the means of living are tourism and fishing, and they have the greatest impact from climate change. So we are going to support several countries where they have this kind of activities, and the chain of value includes fishing, but also focusing on protecting ecosystems. This project is very relevant in regards to adaptation. Next slide, please. I would also like to talk briefly about a tool that we currently have available, and it would be available for all the countries of the region. And this is relevant because this was recently approved in the directory that was finished. So we've created an instrument for green action. It accounts for $3 million for structuring projects, and hopefully this could be renewed when we use them adequately. And it's going to allow us to have a portfolio of projects and investment projects. So we want bankable projects to work not only in the identification of ideas, but also to transform these ideas into bankable projects. Many times what the problem that we have is to be able to design or to have good projects. We believe that is extremely necessary to have a tool that is only devoted to green topics. And here we believe that everything related to biodiversity and adaptation require a special support, precisely because we're talking about projects such as recovery of forests and the use of land, sustainable agriculture. All these are part of the same topic: adaptation and nature-based solutions, preservation of ecosystems. As you can see, we have three pillars: preservation, restoration, and sustainable use of biodiversity and the environment. But we believe that the pillar number 1 and 3 are going to require more effort from us and work from our different offices in the different countries and working with our counterparts in order to identify those ideas that can be transformed into bankable projects, because this is going to allow to mobilize financing. Many times we do not mobilize enough information because we don't have well-identified projects or well-designed projects, and they do not exist because there's a lack of resources, and the border between the two topics is very confusing. So that's why we want to devote our effort in this aspect. I think that my time is up, but I think that we can go to my last slide. I wanted to point out this topic, that is how important it is to design and prepare the projects and to have this tool that is only devoted to green actions, and that we can invest and invest it correctly. I'm open to any questions, and I'm honored to participate in this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia, for your insightful presentation. I think there are many things to take away from that, but particularly the value of linking across agendas, the importance of transforming ideas into bankable projects, and those practical examples of how CAF are moving forward on this agenda. Okay, perhaps there are some connection issues there. So what I'd like to do is move on to the next discussant. So I'd like to ask Mr. Eduardo Gonzalez from the Central American Bank for Economic Integration for his intervention.
Gracias, Michael, por la oportunidad.
Thank you very much, Michael, for having given me the opportunity to be part of this session. And I prepared a series of slides to guide this presentation. My name is Eduardo Gonzalez. I'm a specialist on climate change, and I work for the Central American Bank of Economic Integration. And we are very interested in this topic, and we've implemented several actions to strengthen the adaptation of the countries. We have participation in the SICA area, including Colombia and Argentina, who are partners. And we have a presence in these areas. So the bank has had a systematic strategy to integrate the change of climate change in different instruments. And in this first slide, you might not see the whole idea, but what we want to do is to be able to understand how important adaptation is in the financing processes, including or considering climate change risks. So on the one side, we have physical and transition risks. These physical risks are very relevant in our intervention areas because we have very, very vulnerable areas, and we also have transition risks. And on the other side, we have opportunities to develop new business models, new markets that can be beneficial for the private sector in our countries. And these two elements have to be considered in the risk management model, and adaptation also has to be included. And why is it important for us to include adaptation? Well, it is extremely relevant because this is going to have an impact on financing. If these risks are not correctly handled, and of course, this is going to have consequences on the income of the companies and the countries, and this will lead to another risk to increase debt. So we are considering the adaptation element in our projects in order to mitigate these risks and to make safer the recovery of dividends
implican porcentajes demasiado
to be
grandes.
part of these adaptation projects. In that regard, the bank is working on several financial instruments. Next slide, please. Thank you. In that regard, bank is working on several instruments. We do have several instruments to strengthen the focus on climate change. For example, we have an active connection for the development of different lines of credit with all our European and other region partners such as KfW, AFD, and so on. So we've been able to mobilize a great amount of resources for climate change projects between the 2015 and 2021. And these resources have been mobilized through all these European partners and from other regions that have a lot of experience working on green projects. And we also develop special instruments for adaptation and mitigation, more focus on adaptation in the last year due to the specific needs of our region. And in this case, the bank is handling international and regional funds such as the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund, and we handled most of the mobilization of these funds. And additionally, the bank has also created a specific funds for climate change for a project that we're going to see later on. There are several financing instruments, for example, the ones for policy development. And through these instruments, we are supporting countries to develop their policies and to regulate climate change. And we've focused on these development policy so that they include mitigation, adaptation, and their national adaptation plans, because we see that many of our countries lack these and we have to strengthen these. So through these financing instruments, we are supporting the countries in the region. We give them technical counseling, but we also give them financing. Another important instrument can be our contribution through green and theme bonds. We've created a taxonomy to be able to identify an important portfolio of green projects to where we can mobilize important resources and to foster investment to adaptation, nature-based solution, and green policy, and so on. Next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. As it was mentioned by my colleague in the previous presentation, and the way we understand it, countries need resources, funding. They need to have enough resources to address the vulnerability that we have. But one of the main challenges is to create this portfolio of projects, of green projects that we can present to the multilateral bank system. this is a challenge because of the lack of planning that we have in the region. In that regard, we have identified this vulnerability, and we've created a program, a specific fund for climate change investment project preparation fund. And there is where we can prepare high impact projects with non-reimbursed cooperation that strengthen environmental sustainability, adaptation, and mitigation of climate change in priority sectors for the SICA region and Colombia, Costa Rica, Honduras, Nicaragua, Salvador, Belize, Panama, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Colombia. They are beneficiaries of this fund, and they can have access to this through the Central America Bank, and is for government institutions or ministries that want to work on these financing projects, or also for private institutions or designated national authorities and focal points, because we know that this is essential for financing adaptation. And see, they are working on business models for the private sector so that they can also integrate adaptation measures, but considering the risk of the investments and so on. In this fund, we have several donors, such as the European Union, the Spanish Corporation, KfW, and resources from our own bank. So we've been, the last semester, we require proposals in the energy sector, sustainable projects, and we received more than 20 proposals that were presented in the region with a potential of an event that accounts more than $56 million. And currently we are financing several feasibility studies to transform these proposals in bankable projects or initiatives that can be implemented by our bank on some other partners or donors, because we're also working with our counterparts in other countries or other banks. And I would like to finish by saying how that our bank considers that adaptation is essential. It's important to prepare our preparations. When we already receive operations that have already been designed, it's very complex to integrate adaptation measures. So we are focusing currently in the preparation of projects so that these designs are already have this vision, that they already include risk, adaptation, and all the relevant information and indicators that they need to have in regards to our region, and to be able to present these projects to before our other donors, or to be able to increase the investment for our region, Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'll be here and I'll pass the floor to my other colleagues, and I'll get any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Eduardo, for that excellent intervention. And I think particularly that closing point about the importance of getting in early to shape the project design is very well taken. Okay, so now I'd like to pass the floor back to Ms. Bonilla from the Ministry of Environment in the Dominican Republic. Ms. Bonilla, are you there?
Thank you so much. Buenos días y buenas tardes a todos y todas. Es un honor participar en este
Good morning. This is an honor to participate in this third regional policy dialogue on environmental sustainability. On behalf of the Ministry of the Environment and Natural Resources, I'm here to present. We are working in close collaboration with the Global Institute to promote the participation of the private sector in energy climate financing. We also work with international agencies and both private and public sectors. Adaptation is essential to our country because our country is very vulnerable, with lots of people whose livelihood depend on natural resources, and we need financing to attain objectives of planning for adaptation. Some of our most emphasized actions include a program, which is a joint initiative with the Ministry of Economy, Planning and Development of the country, with the objective of improving our capacity to mobilize financing for climate change and to promote the participation of the private sector in projects of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. There's also the renewable energies program with the Ministry of Mines that includes implementation of projects with renewable energy in different sectors, public buildings included, by promoting changing technology to promote private investment in public and private energy efficiency projects. We also have another project for a green taxonomy within the framework of a climate change financing project in Latin America and the Caribbean, FinClima, with the Ministry of the Environment and other agencies. And the objective is to increase countries' capacity to access climate financing and mobilizing private investment in projects related to climate change. We promote public-private alliances to increase financing. Another project for strengthening the NDA for the participation of the private sector and support the accreditation of the Center for Agricultural Stock Breeding and Forest Development Center directly from the from the Environmental Fund. We are also developing a guide for the implementation, promotion, and follow-up of green banking focused on climate actions. And we are also working on training regarding climate finances with international stakeholders and key stakeholders in the country. We are developing a national roadmap for sustainable finances. We are working with different entities, international entities, to promote the participation of the private sector in climate financing through different projects and mechanisms. The objective is to support a transition towards a low carbon economy, promoting sustainable development and attaining the goals of the Dominican Republic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that insightful and concise presentation. It's very much appreciated. Okay, and now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Sebastian Nieto-Parra from the OECD Development Center. Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. So voy a por supuesto aprovechar.
Thank you very much. I will make use of the interpretation service and I will present in Spanish, but the slides will appear in English. It is a pleasure to be here today to share with you some of the analysis that Development Center has been working on specifically for America Latina. We present a report every year with our colleagues from CAF, from ECLAC and the European Commission. I would like to share my presentation with you. This is based on our report and what we've been working on revenue statistics in Latin America. We have mentioned several times how important it is to talk about financing needs when we discuss adaptation in the region. And we need to look at these needs, and we need to close infrastructure gap. It is necessary to increase investment in infrastructure by about 5% of regional GDP. This is for infrastructure. But when we start talking about employment market, and if we want a net positive effect in terms of jobs, then we need to invest more than 3% additional points in green sectors by 2030. These are estimates for Latin American countries. Without this investment, if we focus only on mitigation and decarbonization policies, the net effect on employment will be negative. And that's why it is so important to focus on the employment market. Now, when we go specifically to the renewable energy matrix. To achieve 100% matrix by 2030, we need to invest 1.3% of the regional GDP for 10 years. So these are different investment needs in Latin America, and therefore it's important, it is fundamental to have public and private investment. When we focus on revenues, this will have impact on mitigation actions. This includes environmental taxes, and at the end of the day, this helps to the decarbonization policy. And the big question is then, how do these additional revenues, like 1%, can be taken from 1% in Latin America to the 2% in other OECD countries, and therefore how are we going to spend additional resources focusing on adaptation policies? And thanks to the revenue report from Latin America and the Caribbean, we see there's potential for higher revenues, but this potential by itself will not lead to adaptation policies. We have already discussed the importance of finding new mechanisms in capital markets. And for Latin America, when we focus only on green social bonds, green social sustainable bonds, and when we talk about bonds related to sustainability with an effect on the bond, we see an increase in Latin America. This is good news, specifically when we talk about sustainability related bonds, but also social bonds in the region, and we see important growth. So far for 2022, we've seen important actions. And it is interesting to note that the private sector has an increasingly important job. In 2021, for instance, it had the highest rate of issuances. And today we see that the public sector is gaining force in 2022 through two key issuances, Uruguay and Chile, with sustainable related bonds. Uruguay is a good example, showing that this not only has an impact on the adaptation policies as a whole, but also better prices than standard bonds in the market, as Uruguay was doing in the past with global bonds. This is a very interesting mapping then. And as I exemplified by the Uruguay issuance that I already mentioned. Here we are only focusing on international issuances, but there are also local issuances, like, for example, Colombia. Colombia was the first to issue a green bond at the domestic level in local markets, and this was very good and had a great impact. But the question behind is, how much is this linked to mitigation policies and how much to adaptation policies? I would like to emphasize that sustainable finance frameworks in Latin America have been moving away from merely looking at the environmental perspective to a more sustainable perspective. And this is an important progress, like shown by the bonds I already mentioned. But there are three main challenges. The main challenge is how to increase our knowledge and capacity to assess climate risk and to identify eligible projects to analyze these actions, to look at investment projects and addressing the gaps, developing robust criteria for resilience, which is essential. Third one is about developing the guidelines for adaptation taxonomies, where we need to determine how much of these bonds include a criteria for adaptation. and the impact, not only looking at planning before going into the primary market. This has to do with the method and the taxonomy, but we must also focus once the bonds are in the market, who is evaluating them? Do they have an impact on adaptation? And it is important then to be aware of the role the different stakeholders like external reviewers have, and because they can give us a comprehensive view of the use of these bonds. And basically, many of the criteria that we have are looking at the revenue, but this has an effect when we see comparability and the accuracy of the bonds. And this is something that we really want to emphasize because this is a call for action. Our Latin America report focuses not just on the sources and mechanisms needed to continue moving forward. I must insist that it is necessary to harmonize sustainability standards, as we've been discussing. And I want to add something. Internationally, there are different criteria and different fields where we have advanced. And the ICMA has been also doing a lot of work, and we can see the effects internationally. Regionally, there have also some works being done regarding sustainable financing and taxonomy, and CAF, for example, and other international organizations are involved, and this can help for a regional framework. And there also work is being done for green taxonomies at the national level, but accuracy levels and comparability are different, and the field of application, which talks about the need of better standardization. A second point that I had already mentioned is the need to advance with investment projects, and we have other important points. We need to look at the country level projects and work on green, social, sustainable bonds. And undoubtedly, we need to find mechanisms to create incentives for sustainable finances. Investors have an appetite, and Latin American countries saw that it is possible to apply really focused actions and policies as seen during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So thank you very much. This is all on my part.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, look, I'm keeping a bit of an eye on time after my promise to Aya. So I'd like to open the floor now for further interventions, comments, and questions.
Hi, Michael. This is Paul Martin from the World Bank. Shall I just go ahead, or are you going to call on people?
Paul, go for it, please.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I'll keep my intervention short, my comment short, but I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that was said earlier on. So in the World Bank, our climate finance target is 35% of lending. And of that, we've committed that at least half should be for adaptation. And last year, we provided nearly 13 billion in adaptation finance. But of course, it's clear, as we've been hearing, that major investment gaps remain. And as you yourself mentioned, Michael, the average benefit cost ratio is estimated to be like 4-to-1 for adaptation finance. So this kind of finance brings tremendous return. And now the challenge is to find sources and channels for increased volumes. And these have to go beyond public funds to mobilize private investments. And here I just wanted to bring to the attention of the discussion a recent World Bank report. I could put a link in the chat. I guess we have a chat here somewhere if it's useful. It's called Enabling Private Investment in Climate Adaptation and Resilience. And interestingly, the approach outlined in that report reflects a lot of what Alicia from CAF was saying about having a structured approach, which I think is important for the region. It sort of goes through a process of long-term adaptation planning to development of national adaptation investment plans, and then identifying bankable projects. And then institutions such as ours can support specific project preparation and help individual projects get to close the transaction. So that report provides a sort of interesting and hopefully useful approach to scaling up private investment in climate adaptation. And I'd also like to mention that as well as having funds available to prepare for and protect against extreme weather events, we also need to increase our ability to channel funding for recovery. And in this regard, just around the time of the COP last year, with other development partners, we launched the Global Shield Financing Facility, which I just want to make sure everyone's aware of, which helps develop ODA eligible countries access financing to deal with climate shocks. It builds on the earlier Global Risk Financing Facility, and it will channel grants through projects of the World Bank and other development agencies. And these take an approach of integrated financial protection. It supports financial packages to complement adaptation and disaster risk reduction to enable and mobilize private capital for improved financial resilience by offering private financial solutions, including insurance and other risk transfer instruments, including catastrophe bonds, which have already been mentioned. So I just wanted to highlight these two things from the World Bank side, the report and the new facility. And if it's useful, I could put links in the chat so people can follow up on those. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. And then actually from my side, I can put in a second endorsement for that World Bank report on enabling private investment. It's really excellent contribution. Okay, so look, firstly, I'd like to give the floor to Santiago Lorenzo and to Catalina Pietrita. So firstly, Santiago, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. Yes, no, I just want to congratulate all the expositors because I think they have come to something, and also to you, to OECD, because this is a very relevant thematic part for the region. The key problem for the region is its vulnerability to climate change, and adaptation is almost. And yes, many of you have already highlighted that the finance is not coming in the volume required, and yes, we know that usually it's considered that most of adaptation projects are really not. They don't have let's say an appropriate potentially appropriated return. These benefits that Paul was mentioned, most of the benefits are not monetized, but anyhow there are some that are monetized. So there is a space, a very interesting space for private finance, and mostly I would say it is not in project finance. It's mostly all those corporations, firms, small and medium enterprises that act in different ecosystems that will be impacted. They need to invest in adapting their own business models, their strategies, the commercial strategies, and that will be the key building point for private adaptation finance. I presume that most of the business in the region need to adapt, and that will be the source of the money of the private money in that. And the mechanism that Eduardo and Sebastian mentioned about green bonds, etc., will be key to have access for those actions in private action. But anyhow, we have been also working on the co-benefits. We will launch a report very soon on the co-benefits of investing in adaptation, and they are clear in employment, in GDP, and also in other economic and social indicators, and mostly in the line of the global adaptation coalition that they mentioned about from 2 to $10 US per dollar invested. We are around that figure as well. So, and we design a methodology that our hope is that this methodology will be used by, for instance, the public investment offices in the region. We have a good relationship with them, so they can assess the impact of their investment in adaptation with this economic and social benefits that will really mobilize more interest around this subject. I want to quote Alicia that we are hosting CAF this week here in CEPAL in their meetings, and I'm very glad we could share some ideas. Latin America is a mega diverse region. It's a continent with such a richness on biodiversity that the ecosystem approach in adaptation is key for the region. It's not only to adapt, is to make these ecosystems thrive, because there is an economy there that we have not been so intelligent to really make it productive, but there is a huge scenario for demand in the future of biodiversity related goods and services. And in that sense, the bridge between the climate change agenda and the biodiversity agenda comes with a 30 by 30 objective. Adaptation, in looking, as Alicia mentioned, in key ecosystems. She mentioned about migratory birds, mangroves will be key also for the defense against rising seas. We know that there are amazing ecosystems, habitats. We have the Central America, we have southern Mexico, we have the Mato Grosso, Amazonia. There are so many places that we need to conserve, and from there we can really have a new use for adaptation. We need to invest in those ecosystems. So public money requires indicators, because any parliamentarian that approves a fund, they need to show that they have results, outcomes, and indicators in adaptations have been a problem. So we need to work that harder. There are different landing processes, because this is very local, but we need to agree more on harmonization of these indicators, on why the indicators chosen are the right ones for adapting, for finance adaptation finance. So in that regard, we need a little bit more work there for public money, and on private money, we need that to mobilize the local businesses to be aware that they need to invest in that, and to provide the adequate instruments. I will leave it there, but just to that this conversation needs to continue and to foster, because it's urgent that we really clarify the pathway for this to strengthen adaptation finance. And I think all the actors that are having gathered today are key for doing that properly. So my message is, let's put more attention on ecosystem-based adaptation. But as Sebastian mentioned, we need to invest in infrastructure, of course. The investment in the investment rate in the region is 19% of GDP. It's very low. It's the lowest in the world. We need to understand why capital markets are not investing in the region, and part of this investment requires to be in infrastructure for the ecological transition. Thank you, Michael. Thank you all.
Thank you, Santiago. Okay, so we have two final interventions before wrapping up the session, and then afterwards, Sarah Gonzalez. So, Catalina, please.
Thank you, Michael, for giving me the floor. My name is Catalina Piedrahita, and I'm professional of adaptation at the Directorate of Climate Change of the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. And I'm going to speak in Spanish to expose the points of Colombia. Bueno, entonces, en cuanto a definir un poco y entender las prioridades que tiene Colombia en materia de
It is
adaptación.
necessary to begin by understanding Colombia's priorities in adaptation. For our country this year, it is important to attain vertical articulation of different planning and adaptation instruments in Colombia in order to bring all of these goals and measures to our country. We have some adaptation goals that are focused mainly on the different economic sectors. One priority is to bring these measures to the different territories, to bring them to a more regional and local level. And we have to work hand in hand with the National Plan to Adaptation to Climate Change, which was recently updated and includes an action plan. It goes in line with the territorial climate change management plans and the sector climate change management plans. To attain our objectives and considering the financial tools, Colombia believes it is important to attain risk transfer so that we can articulate financial instruments and tools to attain the objectives in the plans. Colombia believes that the use of instruments for a proper risk transfer in adaptation projects and programs nationally and at the territory level that will help reduce damages on most vulnerable stakeholders are fundamental, and they go hand in hand with an increase in the response capability less vulnerable stakeholders in the territory have. Secondly, we believe it is necessary for the insurance sector to be involved with parametric insurance that help limit financial impact of devastating events like cyclones, earthquakes, extreme rainfall, and others that can affect Colombia and Latin America in general. And the long-term insurance management can also help us face a progressive change in climate patterns. Something that has already been mentioned by panel members is index bonds for specific adaptation programs for sustainable development in line with priorities of this country, blue bonds, credits, and biodiversity associated bonds. Fourth, it is important to strengthen the monitoring and assessment system so that we can verify the implementation of the different measures in our territories. And as we have more effective and efficient measures, we will be able to propose territory level adaptation projects that are more financeable by the multilateral banks. And something that is related to what I said at first, we need proper risk management, and we have to issue proper messages for resilient climate action. And we have to link the private sector, involve them through different initiatives to reduce the impacts of transition on the Colombian economy, which is essential. Finally, I just want to say that Colombia has been working on different instruments. Right now, we are just working on a climate financing strategy. We have also been working on a green taxonomy. Thank you very much.
Okay, and now
Thank you so much, Michael. If you have any trouble listening to me, please let me know. I'm going to be very brief because I know that we're running out of time. Y voy a hablar en español a partir de ahora.
And now I'll switch into Spanish. I just want to say briefly that the Dominican Republic is going to prepare the financial sector at the private level as a priority to channel climate financing towards small producers and companies in the industry and power generation sectors, and the financial sector in investment banking. And we are following many examples to develop a taxonomy. We've been looking to Colombia to develop our own taxonomy, but before this taxonomy is ready, in the financial instrument markets like the stock exchange and the stock exchange market we have been developing rules for issuing green and social bonds that help understand how to issue bonds that are specifically labeled for these purposes. All this through the central bank and regulators, which include the stock market surveillance agencies, the bank surveillance agency, and the insurance surveillance agency. It is a priority. Adaptation is a priority. We are part of the Latin American region, but we are also part of the Caribbean region. And it is no secret that as an island, as a developing island country, vulnerability is really important to us. And it is a priority in territory planning and in projections for economic and financial stability in our country. So in this sense, the nationally determined contribution has a strong component of adaptation, where priorities are clear and adaptation measures to be considered to establish financing strategies. That's all. I know we're running out of time, but I want to say thank you very much for the opportunity that I was given. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, look, I think the speakers have been so clear and eloquent that I won't attempt to summarize what's been said, other than to express my appreciation for the insights and experiences that have been shared over the session, and I think some very useful pointers about how we can move forward on this journey to mobilizing greater finance for climate change adaptation. So with that, I'd like to pass the floor back to Aya for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, moderating the session, and thank you also to all speakers. And there was really wealth of information and interesting facts and information that you shared with us. So we are now ready for the final session, today, the session 3, gender equality and climate change adaptation. And we will have our colleague, Dimitra Xenu, policy analyst at the Green Growth and Global Relations divisions at the Environment Directorate, to moderate. And Dimitra is really our gender and environment expert. So she has been working on this topic already many years. So Dimitra, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Aya. I want to apologize first because I have a bit of a cold, so I might not be sounding very clear, or I might have to blow my nose at some point, so excuse me in advance. Let's move now to the session on gender equality and climate change adaptation. For those of us at least working on gender and environment, we know that women around the world have differentiated, are differentiatedly affected by climate change, deforestation, land degradation, desertification, growing water scarcity, issues with sanitation, etc. This is usually the case both in developing countries and in developed countries in many cases, and it's quite something that we quite see in rural communities. What we also see is that women usually have limited access to land rights, to natural commons, or other assets in comparison to men. And they may face barriers to decent work and finance, or issues with unpaid care work, skills gap, lack of information on accessing green jobs, for example. And of course, these all link also with the gender dimension that climate change has. We've seen also issues specifically with climate hazards and natural hazards, droughts, landslides, floods, hurricanes, etc., where they tend to affect women more due to women's highest economic vulnerability. And also we see from reports that the UN has released in the past that because of traditional gender roles, usually you have women being the most displaced people after such hazards. At the OECD, we've been working on the gender environment nexus for the past 3-4 years. We've released a report on the nexus, looking at it from the SDGs perspective, and we've seen that the links between gender equality and environmental sustainability are quite limited. With UNDP and UN Women, we've also been working on a green gender recovery database, let's say, where we identified measures that link gender equality and environmental sustainability. I won't go into that now. I'm sure we will have the opportunity later on in our discussion. Let's move on now to our session. We have 3 discussants with us, Ms. Verania Chao, Program Specialist for Climate Change and Gender Equality and Inclusion at UNDP, Ms. Maria del Pilar Salazar Vargas, Director of Environmental Economics and Natural Resources at the Mexican National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, and Mrs. Cynthia Cordova, Coordinator on Environmental Economics at the Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica. I'd like to invite you 3 to switch on your cameras. And I would also like to first invite Dr. Rodolfo Godínez Rosales, our environmental law and policy expert, who has passed quite a few years in the Ministry of Environment in Mexico dealing with gender issues, to help us set the scene today. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your take on the evolution of the gender agenda in the international climate negotiations and how this links to national LAC adaptation policies. Rodolfo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Pues muchas gracias. Quisiera invitarlos a tener una...
Thank you very much. I would like to invite all of you to do joint reflection upon the evolution of gender equality in relation to climate change. But we also have some reference to international evolution. So can we go to the next slide, please, and we can zoom in it? I only have 2 presentations, so I'm going to be very brief. Okay, I'm going to summarize this in operation and implementation. Within the United Nations framework and different regional organizations, there has been a lot of work on political instruments, but these public policy instruments have to be implemented through financial cooperation, technology, creation of capacities, and so on. We have to remember that at the beginning of this session, we were talking about an environmental crisis that we're facing. From my perspective, this is a crisis that has several factors. That is, this is a civilization crisis that is using resources and is wasting them. So we have a environmental and social sub-crisis that we also have to deal with. I don't know if you remember back in the 50s, the second secretary of United Nations, Dan Hagler, said that the United Nations were created not to take countries to the heaven, but to prevent the international community to go to hell. And I say this because Antonio Guterres, Secretary of the United Nations, said that we were one step away from the climate hell. So we've had decades of international cooperation, and this hasn't helped us to prevent international community to go to climate health. And we have a lot of actions and voices from everybody, but from certain groups that have been very active and have shown their specific concern on actions to be taken. We're talking about indigenous groups, young people, and women. Women is the main topic in this session number 3. And they are not only part of the United Nations framework, they are also included in Rio de Janeiro. They've talked about the active participation of women. Towards 1995, there was a conference in Beijing, and it was talked about the link between women and the actions that they can implement in order to improve environment. And all this kept evolving and reflected upon the climate change. And several actions and decisions were taken, and from the year 2001 up to now, to take specific actions to empower women. This empowerment has been difficult to achieve, and out of the 193 countries that are part of the international community, there have been several voices that have become an obstacle for women to raise their voices. But there have been other voices that have allowed a greater participation from women. And not only that, but female leaders in these negotiations. We have to remember that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we've had 2 female representatives or leaders in the climate change topic. It is also important to remember that the current director of OECD, Joe Tyndall, was the co-chair of the working group of the Paris Agreement with another female colleague, Sarah Basham from Saudi Arabia. So these female leaders is closely related to climate change, and it's also related to several decisions that have been made. I'm not going to elaborate on each one of these decisions, but these decisions have been taken since 2001, represent the empowerment of females, the decision-making process made by females, mobilization of financing, and so on.
Hacia 2014, y vean ustedes cómo esto evoluciona de manera muy lenta.
Towards the year 2014, and this has been very slow. In Rio de Janeiro, we talked about empowerment of females in 95. In Beijing, we also talked about women, and up to 2014, 20 years later, in the climate change, we have a work program, a specific work program. It's a 2-year program that talks about capacity building and leadership and very specific actions so that women can fight against discrimination that has been a constant obstacle in the last decades. And this has led to the evolution for the year 2017. This working plan has several actions and that include gender. And we have the Paris Agreement, where it talks about female empowerment and gender equality. And since we are linking this to adaptation, the Article 7 in Paris Agreement, we talk about adaptation, women, capacity building, empowerment of women. So we have Paris Agreement 2015, where they specifically make reference to gender equality, empowerment of women in the 7th paragraph. And in 2019, there was a decision of the working program of Lima on gender. So now we have public policy instruments at international level from Rio de Janeiro, Beijing, in the Convention of Climate Change that provide us with legal certainty in regards to what actions and the steps have to be followed in order to implement these actions. This is at the international level. Next slide, please. Now, how Next slide, please. How have we seen this locally? We see adaptations in regards to communication, and currently 15 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have presented adaptations in regards to communication. Here we can see the list, alphabetical list of this topic. The first one was presented in 2019 up to 2023. As you can see, all these international policies have been reflected upon specific actions. All countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have presented their actions, and their plans have included gender, how they can empower women, how women can be leaders, how can they increase their capacity building. And here you can see the list of all these actions. Now, it is true that we have all these public policy instruments available, and after this, I would like to pass the floor to the discussants. And how can these have a real impact on the implementation at the local or internal level? Because all these decisions that were made in Lima, Madrid, Bonn, and so on conclude by saying that everything is subjected to budgetary decisions. That is, that the countries allocate enough money so that this becomes reality. So we haven't taken this concrete step. I mean, we have many promises, but we haven't seen the final stage. We have seen some examples of how European banks, all the green fund, allocate funding or financing for these projects, but it's not enough. And that's why I would like to go back to the beginning of the presentation. We require regional cooperation, not only international cooperation. And we've mentioned several examples. And we need the cooperation of everybody, regional cooperation that is essential for the implementation of these action plans and empowerment of women. And that is all from my side. I would like to pass the floor to the discussants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo, for your intervention. It was a very nice point, and you took us through the different stages of the negotiations, and you did highlight key points on women's economic empowerment, leadership, and of course, financing gender sensitive or gender responsive projects. I'll mention here that we have been working on these issues at the OECD a bit. First of all, on the gender environment nexus, and what we've been trying to explain to countries at least is that usually we have the specialists on environment working on environmental policies and the specialists on gender working on gender equality strategies, but sometimes you need to look at the 2 points together. And we've been working on trying to do the mapping of the interlinkages between the 2 issues. We have only one report with a case study on Greece, and we did find some specific recommendations that have to do with economically empowering women in male-dominated environmental sectors, or increasing women's presence in environmental leadership and decision-making, or even supporting gender-sensitive environmental justice, which is one of the key points that were raised also in the international negotiations. And of course, enhancing and monitoring and integrating the gender environment nexus into national policies. That's one part of the work we've been doing, and we've also released a very interesting policy paper on integrating a gender lens in sustainable finance. I think I'll put the link later in the chat, because I think it's a quite good work that my colleagues have done on mainstreaming gender considerations in finance and investment, and on enhancing mobilization of financial resources. And it does give a few points on what needs to be done on multilateral financial mechanisms and on gender-based criteria, etc., and setting gender-based criteria for fund disbursement, etc. I'll now move to the speakers. I'm not sure if Verania has managed to join in. I know she was having another meeting before this one, so she might be running a bit late. Is Verania with us today? No?
Yes, thank you, Dimitra. Hi, everyone.
Thank you, Verania. Verania, I'll let you take the floor and provide your insights on how to integrate the gender equality considerations in climate change adaptation actions and the work that UNDP has been doing in the region. Thank you.
Muy bien, gracias, Dimitra. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Dimitra. First of all, I would like to thank for having been invited by OECD to participate in this third dialogue. My name is Mariana Chao, and I am a thematic leader in the team the climate change and gender equality and inclusion, the UNDP in headquarters in New York. So it's an honor for me to be able to share some reflections with you. First of all, I would like to share with you, well, it has been already mentioned in the previous presentations, but we know how important gender equality is and the social inclusion is in the policy processes in regards to climate adaptation. And we know, and we have all heard this, so it's important to point out that vulnerabilities and the context we live in and the contents we live when we face climate change are not the same for everybody, and therefore the solution that we have to plan or finance have to be adequate for the needs of the different groups and populations. And we have to acknowledge the differences of these groups, including gender differences. And this is as a result of structural inequalities that we have in different groups of women and men. So in that regard, I would like to mention that based on our working experience that we've had in the area of adaptation through the development of national adaptation plans, because we support different countries, and also through the work that we've been doing by supporting countries to design their contributions at the national level, we have identified the need to have broad approach in regards to the integration of gender equality to climate adaptation. We've seen that this broad focus has or could consider three areas that somehow reinforce that the possibility of integration of gender equality is done more systematically. And first of all, we have to secure effective governance regarding its structure. That is to make sure that we have institutional arrangements among the different stakeholders. That is, on the one hand, government stakeholders, where gender institutions are well represented and that they have a clear role, and this many times is translated into later on having a gender and climate change of focal points. And this has already been mentioned by Rodolfo, and this in turn gives place to international policy frameworks. On the other hand, we also have the need to have coordination spaces with non-governmental stakeholders so that we can have the participation of non-governmental stakeholders that participate continuously. And we've also identified the need to have a greater training in public institutions regarding gender integration in this topic. So this is very important, and it's part of this comprehensive focus. We cannot forget planning processes. Planning processes have to be inclusive, and we have to make sure that the different stakeholders, no matter if they are public or private, can be part of a consultation or the decision-making process. Because if we're able to consolidate these processes, this has to be not only when we are writing policy, but we have to consider this as a process, and that throughout this process, we can have this consultation and constant participation of different populations. And we've also considered the possibility to have greater information regarding the differences that we have regarding the men and women roles in these processes, and therefore to be able to strengthen their participation. And the third area in which I consider we need in order to complement this comprehensive focus or approach is to think about comprehensive policy frameworks. For example, when the first national contributions were being designed, we noticed that some countries had already included the gender equality topic in their adaptation plans, but this hadn't been reflected in the CDNC. So we had to find among the different environmental instruments that all the countries could include the gender equality topic, and that they gave priority to the topic too. Nowadays, we clearly see how these CNDCs show how important it is to have public policies on gender that can clarify the mandate of the different institutions. So that I think that is very important to understand in order to have a clear integration of gender and in climate adaptation. And in order to do that, we need to have a very, very wide approach, broad approach. I also believe that we need to broaden the availability of information that is separated by gender, and that we can have more information on vulnerability, and that we can increase the participatory spaces that we have for women and the different stakeholders. And that could be in civil society organizations. And we also have, as an important topic, financing. We know that the actions that we want to implement regarding adaptation in different sectors, if we do not think about the fact that they need to have a specific budgetary allocation, then it's going to be difficult for them to be achieved or implemented. And then regarding the links that we've seen between adaptation actions and gender, we've seen a significant increase. There's 76% of NDCs, or this second generation of NDCs, include specific references to gender or women in regards to climate adaptation in comparison to the 35% of the initial round. And we've seen that 56% of these NDCs, and I would like to point out that I'm talking about the countries that the UNDP has supported directly, but we are talking about more than 120 countries, include a specific gender actions in regards to climate adaptation. So we've seen that there's a greater representation of this link between gender and climate adaptation. And in order to wrap up, it's also important to mention that PNUD, we have a program that is called Escala, and we've supported several countries in the region, including Colombia, Costa Rica, Haiti, and we are supporting them so that they can integrate these concepts and the gender equality in their budgetary projects, and also to increase the participation of women in the chains of value that are generated as a result of considering a more sophisticated agricultural sector and a more sustainable agricultural activities. So that'll be all on my side. We can ask some time for question and answers, and I know that time is limited. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verania, for this very interesting presentation. And yes, I agree with you that these are the key points that you made, and the systematic approach is very interesting because it is something that needs to be promoted a bit more. I'd like now to move to the country perspective on what we've heard. And I'll invite first Mrs. Maria del Pilar Salazar, from Mexico, from the Instituto Nacional de Ecología y Cambio Climático.
Gracias, Dimitra.
Thank you very much. I brought a presentation. If you could please help me. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here to share with you what the federal government and the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change are doing. As Rodolfo said, there are many programs, but they need to be brought down to the ground with concrete results where women can truly decide and change their lives in the context of climate change. Mexico has an updated NDC explicitly recognizing the need for responsive gender focus for each action line in a cross-cutting manner. From the Department of the Environment, we are working with an interinstitutional gender and climate change group. The Foreign Affairs Department also has a feminist foreign policy and an action plan, as mentioned by Rodolfo. But how can we bring all of these elements and put them into specific localized actions, gender responsive and gender transformative? We start with adaptation to climate change, explicitly recognizing the gender focus on the left, and each step evidently includes gender issues, starting with the analysis and vulnerability, where it is important to acknowledge and recognize these specificities and differential access to natural resources. It is important to make gender analysis to include and identify the gender gaps, the importance of information disaggregated by sector. We agree with UNDP. It is important to disaggregate information and to determine which populations are exposed, their adaptive capacity, because this will allow us to develop better adaptation measures at the territorial and regional and macro levels. We must acknowledge vulnerability to climate change, which are differentiated and that are subject to structural gaps that lead to sexual differentiation in employment, barriers that have to be brought down. We've seen in sites of floods where a great number of women are unable to swim or have limited access to information because they stay at home and they hardly have access to TICs. And in case of extreme events associated to climate, there is an increase in the workloads of women, like being the caregivers, etc. And all of these elements must be included in any vulnerability analysis. Now, regarding adaptation and implementation, it is necessary to go back to see their experience, their traditional knowledge. They must also appropriate and feel that they develop the measures, that the measures belong to them. They have to have ownership. And all these measures must be conceived from community realization, leadership, and empowerment of women. Not just informing women, it's not enough. They have to be included in a cross-cutting manner throughout the process. After monitoring and evaluation, it is also important to make a gender-sensitive evaluation to determine whether there was really a reduction in gender gaps amongst the most vulnerable population derived from the implementation of these measures. So we believe that monitoring is very important, and we can include gender-sensitive indicators, and we have to strengthen gender capabilities and consider and take into account lessons learned and share these lessons and this everything that has been learned with other communities and media and networks of women adapting to climate change is important. There are several cases in Mexico with many lessons learned that and good practices and experiences so they can be shared with other groups of women who are also getting organized and facing climate change effects. Next slide, please. We're working on some projects I've already mentioned. Next slide, please. There are some projects linked to adaptation to climate change where we are trying to include gender issues in a cross-cutting manner. We are working on a project with French cooperation for certain projects in vulnerable municipalities in the state of Oaxaca. Women were telling us that spaces were temporary shelter for severe climate-related weather events. They lack planning that includes all the different users' needs and let alone gender focus to prevent violence within the shelters. So it is necessary to start working on measures of adaptation with this focus from the point of conception to prevent such risks and to stop replicating this imbalance between genders. And what about recommendations? Well, next slide, please. I just want to synthesize and give time for discussion. We have also been working with our institute in acknowledging that gender roles are very relevant when people are facing extreme weather events, and therefore it is necessary to analyze the differential impact and consider social and environmental context. In Mexico has a wide diversity of ecosystems, economies, regions. We have large, very large coastlines, and that makes it even more complex to approach and work on well-designed specific adaptations measures. We agree with our colleagues. We need to move forward with better and greater actions to strengthen our capacities before climate change. And financing, of course, is extremely relevant because if we do not have the means to guarantee resources, then we can hardly be able to implement any actions that can really work in transformation. I will stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pilar, for this intervention. And I've noted especially the need for the bottom-up approach and starting from the grassroots level where we can actually identify and detect the key issues and the differentiated needs for the different groups and vulnerabilities. I'm going to pass now the floor to Cynthia Cordova from the Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica, and we'll be interested in hearing your approach. Cynthia, are you here?
Hola, hola, buenos días y buenas tardes.
Good morning and good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have a brief presentation, and Yesterday, we commemorated International Women's Day, and I want to say that in OECD, Costa Rica's positioning of women at managerial positions is 49%, sixth in the OECD and second in Latin America regarding these very relevant metrics, but there's still a lot to be done because 16% of unemployment is found among women compared to 10% of men. About 26.6% of the heads of a home are living in poverty, which is aggravated with the geographical issues. As Dimitri was saying, at first, climate change has the face of a woman. We have poverty, differentiated unemployment rates, land occupancy, and all of this creates more vulnerability aggravated with our geographic conditions. Next slide, please. Costa Rica is highly vulnerable. In 2010, the cost for reparation and reconstruction of infrastructure accounted for 1.01% of our GDP. Drought has extended, as has been seen regionally. Between 1980 and 2017, 1.3 million people were affected by extreme weather events, and impact of extreme events, conservatively speaking, could be between 0.68% and 1.05% of our GDP, and in a higher risk scenario, between 1.64 and 2.50% of our GDP. Next slide, please. We have a national adaptation to climate change plan 2022-2026, where we want to improve vulnerability in the country. Aside from the innovation, resiliency, competitiveness, and prevention principles, it includes one very important, which focuses on gender and participation of different vulnerable groups. Management of knowledge and resiliency, human systems and planning, biodiversity management, basins, sea and coastal spaces, management for adaptation, service and resilient infrastructure, productive and eco-competitive systems, and investment and financial security also are important, and they all have gender issues. Next slide, please. To leverage the whole process, we developed a project called Adaptados, or financed by the United Nations Adaptation Fund, and this initiative has as an objective to reduce community vulnerability to climate change and improving resilience in sectors characterized as critical, including agriculture, water resources, coastal areas, and promoting capacity building. This project is executed by the Cooperation Fund, increasing or fostering gender equality and empowerment of women at a local level. It has improved the life of many women who work in agriculture. They help food security, community security. They learn productive tools, and they share knowledge. Statistics, according to statistics, over 5,000 women have been benefited directly, and indirectly 68,200 people. 587 women have been trained, and there has been an investment of about $500,000 in credits for women. This program develops skills, conditions, favorable financing conditions for payment. There is technical financial accompaniment. It is flexible. regarding collaterals. Another thing that is important that leverages the whole process to give support to women is the Mujeres Natura project between the Ministry of the Environment and Finances for Biodiversity from UNDP. This is a strategy that aims at gender equality and women empowerment in the management and preservation of biodiversity resources, and it is an answer for economic recovery, multidimensionally and multisectorially, with the aim of using nature-based solutions to face climate losses and biodiversity degradation. The objective is to integrate financial solutions as a strategy to improve economic autonomy and mobilizing jobs towards women, contributing to protecting the Costa Rica's natural capital through custom-made financial mechanisms, including the credit Mujeres Natura. It's a credit from the Cooperation Fund. There's another credit for rural women and another one for environmental services. This program has so far given $1,400,000 or about 120 credits given to women for bio business and is based on nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. As Verania and Pilar were saying, I would like to say something about the challenges to face. This project and these activities have been leveraging women's needs before climate change, specifically regarding adaptation. There are important challenges that need a solution. One is access to financing. Rodolfo also mentioned it. We need to develop soft tools that will support women and women organizations that are not formally constituted with no land occupancy, so they can undertake climate change and adaptation actions. Generation of capacities, knowledge, best practices is also essential to help reduce vulnerability before climate change. Quantification of impact and benefits, as mentioned by Pilar, is extremely important. If you don't measure it, it doesn't exist, and we would have a greater impact on actions for women if we give it a climate change focus. Empowerment of women for decision making is a core action. We need the necessary regulatory frameworks where gender includes concrete indicators and goals. And finally, to create and promote alliances and partnerships between the different sectors and stakeholders. So through different mechanisms, they can develop actions that will benefit women and close the gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this intervention, Cynthia. I find it very interesting, and I've mentioned to you before the Mujeres Natura project for me is a very good case study. We've been working, as I mentioned earlier, with UNDP and UN Women on developing a tracker for the COVID recovery measures that are both green and gender sensitive, and from over 2,000 measures that we've looked at, we only identified 45 that were both green and gender sensitive, and that one was one of the key ones that I mean, we looked at it because it was promoting women's economic security, and we found it very interesting because it had a very holistic approach, let's say, to this. I would like now to open the floor for questions or comments if we have about 5 minutes. So if anyone would like to intervene, please raise your hands. And I'll pass the floor first to Ambrioris Casilla. Please, the floor is yours.
Saludos. ¿Me escuchan bien?
Sí, muy bien.
Ok, un placer. I'm Yoris Casilla. Yo soy
It
coordinador.
is a pleasure. I'm Yoris Casilla, Coordinator of Risk Management and Environmental Management and Climate Change from the Ministry for Women in Dominican Republic. I would like to share our experience. The Dominican Republic has an action plan for the current NDC to 2025, including an intergovernmental gender and climate change panel in order to give a cross-cutting view to the topic in both private and public institutions in our country. As Berania mentioned, the Ministry of Women and the National Council for Climate Change and the Clean Development Mechanism, the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources with UNDP are giving the final touches to the agreement, and we estimate that by the first half of this year, the agreement will be signed. On the other hand, the Ministry of Women within the National Gender Equality and Equity has focus on gender equality and environment. The objectives are to increase knowledge on the interrelationship between environment and gender issues, to increase women participation in decision-making mechanisms regarding adaptation and mitigation, risk management and environment, and to manage the participation and aspirations of women in environmental issues at all levels. Our country also developed a gender and climate change action plan where the panel will help foster the results of this plan. And we have challenges like access to financing and integration of actors to bring them together into this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this intervention, Bioris. We still have a few more minutes. If anyone else would like to take the floor, raise some issues. I've noted access to finance, and this is quite a big issue that I think not only LAC countries are facing, but at least from my experience in Greece, it is also an issue. And linking it back to also what we heard from Costa Rica, what I've seen in quite a few European OECD countries, what they're trying to do is mobilize financing through, for example, women-led or agricultural cooperation. So that's a way that that some people actually, or policymakers, are usually dealing with it. This doesn't necessarily solve the issue, but it does provide a platform. Rodolfo Lassi, please, the floor is yours. You have your hand raised. Okay, I'll put this everyone, right?
Thank you very much, Dimitra, and thank to all the participants of this session. I would like to emphasize something that Berania and other colleagues have mentioned. The lack of information is a topic very important when it comes to gender and environment links, specifically adaptation. According to statistics, we know that those most affected by extreme events like floodings and hurricanes are women. As our colleague from Mexico says, women sometimes can't swim, and during floods that leads to a problem, and they are not strong enough, or sometimes they don't have the capacity to physically face such violent events, for example, landslides or hurricanes. Statistics, I believe, can allow us to develop the necessary infrastructure to protect women while performing jobs they must face. Men continue migrating to the cities while women take care of the family and undertake rural productive activities, and rural areas are the most affected by extreme events. And for that reason, they lack the support they need when a climate event happens. And if it moves progressively, such as we have seen the increase of temperature and abandonment of agricultural activities, migration becomes another phenomenon where women has a role. Men needs to support those who are migrating, as we see right now with climate-driven migration, or as we have seen in disasters, natural disasters like earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, where we see that women are undertaking subsistence activities, which in turn increases their vulnerability. And therefore, action plans have to reinforce that part, that are trying to be resilient to climate events. And it is also important to reactivate economy. That means surviving first and then reactivating family and community economies. And banks have a lot to contribute, and governments have a lot to contribute in this issue. I'm sorry if I speak too much, but this is a very important topic for Latin America. Latin America is the most affected region, but we also have large numbers of people marginalized in the most vulnerable sectors and sectors most affected by climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodolfo. And you are right. The trickiest part usually when we're trying to get information and collect data, at least from the experience we've had at the OECD, is let's say framing the intersectionality correctly. So we do have data, but it's always very difficult to actually put these together. For example, we tried developing an indicator on exposure to environmental risks, but it was very difficult to have harmonized socio-demographic data that we could actually develop so that we can develop our statistics, let's say. I think I don't want to take more of your time. I know that at least here it's already past 6:30, which was our finish time, and we do have half of the day tomorrow as well. So I'll thank everyone for your interventions and for joining us in this session. And I'll pass back the floor to Ella to help us close this day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitra, and all the speakers and all those who also intervened in the discussion. So a very good good closing for the day, for today. So we will meet tomorrow at the same time than we started today. So it's at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Paris time. It must be 9 o'clock in New York and in some Latin American countries. So I hope you will be able to join tomorrow. We will have also very interesting topics. The adaptation actions at the local level, and then also the biodiversity and nature-based solutions. We will be looking at them, and I think that today's discussion on policies and financing and gender are very relevant also for tomorrow. So I hope many of you will be able to join and share your experience and join us. So I close the meeting today, and I wish you good afternoon or good evening and see you tomorrow. Thank you.